Aroostook Potato Hills, Maine, September 1892. The air, crisp with the coming autumn, carried the scent of dug earth and the distant, mournful cry of a locomotive. On a small plot cleared from the unforgiving spruce and fir, Lachlan MacAulay was doing something no one in the county had ever seen. He was building a wall that protected nothing. His A-frame cabin, a sharp 40-degree pitch of fresh sawn pine, was already finished, a neat triangle against the sky. But now, with the harvest nearly in and every other sane man mending fences or splitting wood for the winter, MacAulay was hauling field stones. Not for a foundation, not for a chimney, but for a strange, encircling mound. Jedediah Sykes, a timber frame man whose family had built half the barns in the valley, stopped his wagon on the section road. He watched for a long moment as the Scot, a man of medium height, but with the dense build of someone who lifts heavy things for a living, expertly placed a jagged piece of granite onto the growing structure. It wasn't a mortared wall. It was a loose pile, a dry stack, already 6 feet high and a good 8 feet thick at its base. It wrapped around the north and west faces of the cabin, leaving a curious gap of about 1.5 feet between the stone and the wood. "What in God's name is he building?" Sykes muttered to his passenger, Silas Blackwood, who owned the sawmill that had cut MacAulay's lumber. Blackwood squinted. "He calls it a cairn, says it's for the wind. Looks like a damned fool waste of time to me. That's prime stone he could use for a proper cellar." Later that week, Calvin Wadsworth, the county tax assessor, made a special trip. Wadsworth was a man who believed in straight lines, plumb bobs, and the quantifiable value of lumber and nails. He saw the structure not as foolish, but as a violation of logic. He walked the perimeter, his polished boots crunching on stray chips of slate. He tapped the massive, chaotic pile with his walking stick. It made a dull, solid thud. "Mr. MacAulay," he called out, his voice carrying the clipped authority of his office. Lachlan paused, 100-pound stone balanced on his leather-clad knee. "I'll be filing my report with the township office. This structure, it has no mortar, no foundation footing. It is, by definition, a temporary pile of rocks. It adds no taxable value to the property. In fact, I'm rating the cabin itself as shed grade, given this patent foolishness." Lachlan carefully settled the stone into its place, nudging it until it locked with its neighbors. He straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. He looked at Wadsworth, then at the wall, then back. "It is not for the tax man," Lachlan said, his Hebridean accent thick as peat smoke. "It is for the wind." He turned and picked up another stone. The men in the valley had their verdict. The new Scot, the outsider, was mad, building a rock pile around a perfectly good house. The word went around the Grange Hall and the general store. Lachlan MacAulay had gone round the bend. He was building his own tombstone. What did this Hebridean dyker, this man whose hands were schooled in a tradition 1,000 years old, understand about dead air entrapment and the fluid dynamics of wind that the most experienced timber builders in all of Maine had missed? I promise you, the answer to that question is not just a matter of history. It's a lesson in physics, survival, and the quiet genius that so often blooms in the face of mockery. Stick with me, and you'll learn why a pile of rocks can be more sophisticated than a solid wall. If you've ever felt a draft you couldn't trace, let me know in the comments where it was. And by the end of this story, you might just know why. Lachlan MacAulay was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, though he now worked a potato plot out of necessity. And he was certainly not a frontiersman in the mold of his neighbors, men who could read the woods like a book and build a tight log cabin with little more than an axe and an adze. Lachlan was a dyker, a builder of dry stone walls, a trade learned on the wind-swept isles of the Outer Hebrides, off the western coast of Scotland. His hands didn't know the feel of a sawyer's plane. They knew the rough, crystalline bite of Lewisian gneiss. They knew the heft and balance of stones shaped by the Atlantic, and the patient art of fitting them together without a speck of mortar. His people didn't build with wood. They built with stone and turf. On St. Kilda, a remote archipelago his cousins hailed from, they built stone storehouses called cleaton. These were not simple huts, but marvels of vernacular engineering, designed to keep seabirds and grains dry in a climate of horizontal rain and relentless gales. They were double-walled structures, a loose, porous outer wall of stone and an inner chamber, with the gap between them allowing air to circulate, wicking away moisture. Lachlan had never built a proper cleat, but the principle was woven into his very being. It was a language of stone, air, and survival his father had taught him, and his father before him. This knowledge had been useless during his family's first winter in Aroostook. They had arrived too late in the season to build, and had rented a small, conventional board and batten shack from the timber company. That winter of 1891 was a lesson in misery, a slow, grinding education in the physics of cold. It wasn't the dramatic blizzards that were the worst, but the deep, silent, penetrating cold that settled in the valleys for weeks on end. His wife, Morag, a woman as resilient and quiet as her husband, had tried to make a home of the place, but the house fought her at every turn. Lachlan remembered the sharp pop from the pantry one January morning. A bottle of apple vinegar, a small luxury, had frozen solid, pushing the cork from its seal with a crack that sounded like a pistol shot in the frozen stillness. The children, Ewan and Katrina, were perpetually bundled in wool, their breath pluming even indoors near the stove. The simple act of drawing water became a trial. The iron sheave of the well pulley, its grease frozen solid, would seize between pulls, forcing him to haul the bucket up hand over hand, the frozen rope cutting into his mitts. The cold was a thief. It stole comfort. It stole energy. It stole joy. The final insult had been the cured ham, a gift from a neighbor. It hung in the cold corner of the main room. When Morag went to slice it for breakfast, the rind, which should have been supple, was as brittle as glass. It didn't slice, it cracked, splintering into frozen shards. That was the moment Lachlan knew he couldn't fight the cold the way his neighbors did. He couldn't win by burning more wood, by stuffing more rags into the gaps. That was a war of attrition, and the Maine winter had an infinite army. He had to build something that didn't fight the cold, but persuaded it to go elsewhere. He had looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of handling stone, and he remembered the cleaton standing serene in the face of an Atlantic gale. He would not build a Maine cabin. He would build a Hebridean memory. The failure of conventional building was on display all across Aroostook County. The standard cabin was a monument to readily available materials, timber. Men like Jedediah Sykes were masters of the form. They could dovetail corners so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade in, and they raised massive frames of spruce and pine that were strong enough to withstand any snow load. The walls were often a single layer of thick planks, or logs chinked with a mixture of moss, clay, and mud. On a calm day at 20 degrees, they were serviceable. But the Aroostook winter was rarely calm, and it was often far, far colder. The problem wasn't the strength of the walls. The problem was physics. The primary enemy was convection, both outside and inside. A 20-mile-per-hour wind screaming across a flat wooden wall at 20 below zero doesn't just make it feel colder. It actively strips heat from the surface. This process, called wind scour, dramatically increases the rate of heat loss. Every knot, every seam, every hairline crack in the chinking becomes a tiny highway for BTUs to escape. A solid 8-inch pine log has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 10. But when a 30 below wind is hammering it, the effective R value plummets. The outer surface of the wood becomes nearly as cold as the air itself, creating a steep temperature gradient. Heat flows from hot to cold, and the steeper the gradient, the faster it flows. The Bouchard family, 2 miles down the road from Lachlan, knew this intimately. Their cabin was well built, but by January, a thick layer of crystalline ice hoarfrost coated the interior of their north-facing wall. It was the moisture from their own breath and their cooking pot, hitting the super-chilled wood and freezing instantly. They were living inside a refrigerator. To combat this, they burned wood, cords and cords of it. The Henderson family, on the next section over, had a woodpile the size of a small house, a monument to their entire autumn's labor. Still, it wasn't enough. The cast iron stove would glow cherry red, making the area 3 feet around it a blast furnace, while 10 feet away, a cup of water would get a skin of ice. The heat wasn't staying. It was making a frantic dash for the walls, the ceiling, the floor, and escaping into the frozen world. The houses were sieves for heat. They were designed to fight gravity, not thermodynamics. The settlers were trying to solve a problem of thermal dynamics with the tools of structural engineering, and they were losing. Against this backdrop of accepted misery, Lachlan MacAulay began his own build in the late summer of 1892. He started not with stone, but with wood. He purchased the lumber for his A-frame from Silas Blackwood's mill, long, straight-grained 22-foot pine boards. The A-frame design itself was a conscious choice. Its steep 40-degree pitch was designed to shed the heavy snows of a Maine winter, preventing the catastrophic roof collapses that sometimes plagued flatter designs. But it also minimized the surface area of the north and west walls, the windward faces, presenting the smallest possible profile to the prevailing winter gales. The construction of the frame was simple, almost brutally so. It was a tent made of wood, a pure, strong shape. Once the wooden shell was up and the roof shingled, the real work began. The work his neighbors found so incomprehensible. For weeks, every morning after a simple breakfast of oats and tea, Lachlan would take his stone boat, a low-slung sled pulled by his placid ox, and make his way through the surrounding woods and fields. This part of Maine, scraped clean by glaciers millennia ago, had left a parting gift: stone. Endless, variable, and free for the hauling. He wasn't looking for neat square blocks. He sought out the awkward, the irregular, the lumpy, and the jagged. Granite, slate, quartzite, the geological refuse of the ages. He would lever a stone from the earth, sometimes weighing 200 pounds or more, and wrestle it onto the stone boat. Back at the cabin site, he would unload, creating great piles of raw material. Then came the building. It was a slow, contemplative process, a conversation between man and stone. He never used a plumb line or a level. His only tools were his hands, his eyes, and a small, heavy hammer for chipping off a troublesome corner. He started the base of the cairn a full 8 feet thick, laying the largest, flattest stones down first. As he built upwards, he followed one of the core principles of the Hebridean dyker. He always angled the stones slightly downwards towards the outside. Any rain that penetrated the wall would be guided back out, never towards the cabin. The wall rose, not as a flat, uniform surface, but as a chaotic tapestry of shapes and shadows. It was this very chaos that was the heart of the design. Calvin Wadsworth made his pronouncement during this phase. He stood, arms crossed, as Lachlan fitted a triangular piece of slate into a gap between 2 rounded granite boulders. "A loose stack berm is not real construction," Wadsworth declared, more to the air than to Lachlan. "It has no structural integrity in the legal sense. I cannot, in good conscience, assess this as a permanent improvement. The cabin's value will be rated as shed grade for the patent." Lachlan paused, his gaze following the line of the stone. He had maintained a precise 14-inch gap between the rising cairn and the wooden siding of his A-frame. This gap was sacrosanct. He looked over at the assessor. "The value is not for your books," he said quietly, and returned to his work, fitting the stone until it sat without rocking. His wife, Morag, would bring him his midday meal. She watched the wall grow with a quiet trust that baffled their neighbors. "It looks like the hills of Lewis have come to visit," she said one afternoon, shading her eyes. "But what is the space for, Lachlan? Between the stone and the wood?" "The space is for the stillness," he replied, tapping a keystone into place. "The wind will beat on the rocks. The rocks will hold the air. The air will keep us warm." By the first snowfall in November, the cairn was complete. It stood 6 feet high, a massive, craggy ring of stone embracing the 3 most vulnerable sides of the small house. It looked ancient, primal, like a piece of a ruined fortress. To the men of Aroostook, it looked like the grandest folly they had ever witnessed. The mockery lasted all autumn. The validation would last all winter. To understand what Lachlan MacAulay had built, you have to understand the 2 powerful physical principles he was harnessing. These weren't magic. They were the sober, predictable laws of thermal science, applied with a genius born of tradition. The first principle was the windbreak. The second was dead air entrapment. First, the windbreak. Imagine a bitter January night. The thermometer reads 20 degrees below zero, but the wind is blowing at 20 miles per hour. The wind chill factor, which we all know from weather reports, makes it feel like 45 below to exposed skin. That same effect applies to the wall of a house. The moving air constantly scrubs away the thin layer of slightly warmer air at the building's surface, forcing the wall to lose heat at a much faster rate. It creates an enormous thermal gradient, the invisible cliff that all your heat is trying to fall off. Lachlan's 8-foot-thick stone cairn was, first and foremost, a massive physical barrier. The wind, which had an uninterrupted fetch of half a mile across a frozen potato field, didn't slam into the wooden wall of the A-frame. It slammed into a 6-foot-high, 8-foot-thick wall of irregular stone. The cairn absorbed the full kinetic energy of the gale. The wind could not scour what it could not reach. In the 14-inch gap between the cairn and the cabin siding, the air was almost perfectly still. This created a wind shadow. While the temperature on the outside of the cairn might be 28 degrees and the wind might be creating an effective temperature of 45 degrees, the siding of the A-frame was only experiencing the still air temperature of 20 degrees. Lachlan's design had, in a single stroke, eliminated the entire effect of wind chill on his home's walls. This alone reduced the apparent temperature gradient by a staggering 18 degrees at the siding, a figure modern science can calculate but that Lachlan understood in his bones. The wind was still there, a roaring monster just feet away, but his house didn't know it. It was like sheltering in the lee of a mountain. But that was only half the equation. The second and more subtle principle was dead air entrapment. This was the ancient magic of the cleat. A solid wall, even a thick one, will conduct cold. A solid stone wall, in fact, is a terrible insulator. But Lachlan hadn't built a solid wall. He had built a stone sponge. His cairn was composed of thousands of irregular field stones piled loosely. The gaps between them were not uniform. They formed a labyrinth of interconnected but small pockets. When air is trapped in a small enough space, it cannot circulate. It cannot form the convection currents that are so efficient at transferring heat. The air becomes dead air, and dead air is one of the best insulators on the planet. It's the principle behind the puffy feathers of a bird, the hollow fibers of wool, and the fiberglass insulation in a modern attic. The 8 feet of loosely stacked stone in Lachlan's cairn created an almost unbelievable thickness of trapped air. Each small void was a tiny thermal break. Heat trying to escape the cabin would have to cross the 14-inch air gap, then warm the first layer of stone, then cross a tiny air pocket, warm the next stone, cross another pocket, and so on, thousands and thousands of times. The cumulative effect was staggering. The cairn itself, a structure made of highly conductive stone, was acting as a massive insulating blanket with a calculated R value of at least 12. Combined with the wooden wall of the A-frame, Lachlan had created a super-insulated wall system that his neighbors, with their single-layer log walls, could not even dream of. He had built a home that was not merely sheltered from the wind, but wrapped in a thick blanket of the very air itself. That December, winter did not so much arrive as descend. It fell upon the Aroostook Hills like a judgment. The cold began in the days before Christmas and did not relent. It was an Aroostook cold air drainage event. The meteorology was simple and brutal. A high-pressure system of Arctic air settled over the region, and with no wind to stir it. The heaviest, coldest air pooled in the valleys and basins, growing colder each night under clear, starry skies. For 12 consecutive nights, the mercury in the official thermometer at the Presque Isle station did not rise above 30 below. For most of the nights, it hovered at a soul-crushing 36°4. For the conventional cabins, it was a state of siege. At the Bouchard residence, the fight was lost. They abandoned the main room and huddled in the small bedroom, all 4 of them, with a small tin stove they normally used for laundry. They stuffed the chimney with rags to prevent drafts. The ice on the inside of their main wall was now an inch thick, a glittering, beautiful, and terrifying sign of total failure. At the Hendersons, the giant woodpile seemed to shrink before their eyes. The patriarch and his eldest son were taking 4-hour shifts day and night, just to feed the ravenous box stove. The sound of the axe splitting frozen maple echoed in the pre-dawn stillness, a desperate drumbeat against the cold. Inside the MacAulay A-frame, the world was different. The first sign was the quiet. Outside, the frozen trees cracked and boomed in the deep cold, sounding like rifle shots. Inside, there was only a profound silence. The roar of the wind was a distant murmur, a story happening to someone else. The single, smallish stove in the center of the room was not glowing red. Lachlan kept it fed with a steady but remarkably small amount of wood. A single log at a time was enough to keep the stovetop warm enough for a kettle to simmer. Morag went about her domestic chores in a state of near normalcy. She was able to bake bread, the yeast rising properly in the gentle, even warmth. The children, Ewan and Katrina, were not bundled in layers of itchy wool. They sat on a sheepskin rug on the floor, playing with carved wooden toys, their cheeks rosy not from fever, but from simple, comfortable warmth. A thermometer Lachlan had hung on the wall, far from the stove, read a steady 68 degrees. The ultimate proof, the quiet, unassailable evidence of his success, sat on a shelf in their small pantry. It was a glass jar of pickled herring, brought with them from the old country. The brine was a delicate pink from beets and onions, the fish firm and silvery. Through the entire 12-day siege of cold, the jar sat on its shelf. In every other house in the valley, such items were the first to go. Cellars, thought to be protected by the earth, froze solid. Neighbors would speak of their own jars of pickles or preserves freezing into a single, solid stone of ice that had to be thawed on the stove, the contents ruined and mushy. But Lachlan's herring remained suspended in its clear, liquid brine, each piece of fish perfectly preserved, perfectly crisp. The cold had laid siege to the cairn, had thrown its full force against the 8 feet of stone, and had failed to even touch the simple, humble food that sustained the family within. The cairn had held the line. The vindication, when it came, was not loud or triumphant. It was as quiet and solid as the stone wall itself. In early January, with the cold snap still firmly in place, Calvin Wadsworth was making his rounds on his sturdy little pony. The assessor believed in seeing the state of the county with his own eyes, even in the depths of winter. Near the section corner that marked the edge of MacAulay's claim, the pony stumbled, then limped. A shoe, made brittle by the extreme cold, had cracked and fallen off. The wind was a physical force, a wall of moving cold that stole the breath and burned the lungs. Wadsworth, bundled in the best wool and fur money could buy, felt the cold begin to penetrate his layers almost immediately. He knew MacAulay had a small forge for tool repair. With no other choice, he began to lead the limping pony towards the strange A-frame with its even stranger stone collar. As he approached, the roar of the wind was deafening. It scoured the frozen snow into stinging airborne crystals. His goal was the cabin door, but instinctively, as he drew near the massive cairn, he sought its lee. He stepped into the shadow of the wind and leaned his back against the stone, expecting a shock of biting cold to radiate through his greatcoat. He felt nothing. No, that wasn't right. It wasn't nothing. It was a startling lack of cold. The stone's surface, while cool, was not the brutal, heat-sucking cold of every other rock, tree, and fence post in the county. It was dry. It was still. The vicious wind was howling just over his head, but where he stood in the 14-inch gap, the air was calm. Confused, he pulled off a thick fur-lined glove. He placed his bare palm flat against the rough surface of a large granite stone in the wall. He expected a pain like a brand, the instant freezing of flesh to stone. Instead, his palm registered a surface that was cold, yes, but a dry, neutral cold. It felt no colder than the wooden handle of his walking stick. It wasn't drawing the life out of his hand. It was just there. In that moment, touching that stone, Calvin Wadsworth, the man of numbers and ledgers, understood. He understood more than a week of lectures on thermodynamics could ever have taught him. He looked up. Lachlan MacAulay was coming out of the cabin. He wasn't wearing a greatcoat or a heavy muffler. He wore a simple, thick wool shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearm, as if he had just stepped away from a warm fireside. He wasn't bundled for an Arctic expedition. He was dressed for a cool autumn day. "Mr. Wadsworth," Lachlan said, his voice even, "you have trouble?" Wadsworth just stared for a moment, his mind struggling to bridge the gap between the screaming gale around him and the calm, shirt-sleeved man in front of him. "My pony," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "Threw a shoe." "Bring him," Lachlan said, and turned back to the cabin. Wadsworth followed him inside. The transition was shocking. He stepped across the threshold, and the world changed. The wind vanished. The oppressive, penetrating cold was gone, replaced by a gentle, even warmth that seemed to radiate from the very air itself. He saw the children playing on the floor. He saw Morag kneading dough on a flour-dusted table. He saw the small stove, its door shut, humming quietly to itself. And on a shelf he saw a jar of clear, pink liquid with fish suspended in it, as if it were a summer's day. He looked at the single small window, and there was not a trace of frost on it. He slowly began to unbutton his greatcoat, a garment that suddenly felt absurdly heavy and overwarm. He looked at Lachlan, the quiet man who had hauled rocks all autumn while his neighbors laughed. "You didn't build a wall," he thought. "You built a harbor. News in the backcountry travels on the same currency as survival. What works?" Calvin Wadsworth, a man whose opinion carried the weight of tax assessments and legal filings, became Lachlan MacAulay's most unlikely and powerful advocate. He didn't speak of friendship or character. He spoke of numbers. He told Silas Blackwood that MacAulay had likely burned half the wood of any other family his size. He told Jedediah Sykes about the 68-degree air inside when it was 36 below outside. He described the frost-free window and the unfrozen herring with the zeal of a convert. That spring, Wadsworth arranged a meeting between Lachlan and a representative from the Maine Lumbermen's Association, who was developing a handbook on best practices for winter shelters in their logging camps. The man, an engineer from Bangor, arrived with skepticism and left with a notebook full of sketches and calculations. He was fascinated by the 14-inch air gap, which he termed a thermal buffer zone. In May of 1893, the Maine Lumbermen's Association Winter Shelter Handbook was published. Tucked within its pages, between designs for bunkhouses and root cellars, was a small but detailed section titled The MacAulay Cairn Berm, a novel method for windbreaking and insulation. It featured a precise cross-section diagram showing the A-frame, the 14-inch air gap, and the 8-foot-thick, 6-foot-high dry-stacked stone wall. It noted the use of irregular field stone as key to creating insulative air pockets. The effect was immediate. The printed word, backed by the Lumbermen's Association, gave Lachlan's strange idea a legitimacy that word of mouth never could. That summer and fall, the sound of stone being hauled and placed echoed in other parts of the valley. Jedediah Sykes, the man who had called it a damned fool waste of time, quietly constructed a smaller, 4-foot version around the northern exposure of his own family's home. The Bouchards, with help from their neighbors, built one. By the first snow of 1893, 9 farms in the Aroostook Potato Hills had added stone cairn berms to their existing homes. The laughter had stopped. The building had begun. What Lachlan MacAulay practiced out of inherited instinct is now a cornerstone of modern, high-performance building science. The 14-inch air gap he so carefully maintained is, in principle, the direct ancestor of the modern rain screen. Today's architects and builders create an air gap behind a building's exterior cladding to allow moisture to drain and to create a pressure-equalized buffer that defeats wind-driven rain. Lachlan's cairn was an extreme but effective version of this. His intuitive understanding of the windbreak and the thermal buffer prefigured concepts that engineers would spend the next century formalizing with complex equations. His use of trapped air as insulation is the very soul of every passive house and super-insulated structure being built today. He had no scientific instruments, no BTU calculators, no advanced degrees. He had only the wisdom of his ancestors, the evidence of his own eyes, and the unyielding laboratory of a Maine winter. In the end, what Lachlan built was more than a house. His neighbors, in their fight against the cold, had built fortresses. They built thick walls to stand against the enemy. They saw the wind and the cold as antagonists to be defeated by brute force, by burning more fuel, by building thicker walls. Theirs was a language of opposition. Lachlan's approach was entirely different. It was a language of partnership. He saw the stone not as a weapon, but as a mediator. He saw the air not as an enemy, but as a potential ally, if only it could be persuaded to be still. The final form was not one of aggression. It was one of embrace. He didn't build a wall against the wind. He asked a shepherd's cairn, the ancient marker of safety and place from the moors of his homeland, to come down off the hill and lie beside his family. He didn't build a fortress to keep the winter out. He built a quiet space where the winter simply agreed not to enter. If you enjoyed this look into the forgotten genius of our ancestors, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of practical wisdom. Every subscription helps us dig up these histories. Let us know in the comments if you've ever seen a structure that seemed strange at first, but turned out to be brilliant. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and building science. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. The content of this video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.